Good morning, everyone. Now, I know what you're thinking. There seems to be a lot less of that guy than I remember, okay? You're either thinking that or what went wrong that they brought the children's guy out here? But no, recently, I lost 120 pounds in the past year and a half. Thank you. Some say they don't do it for the applause. I did it just for the applause. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, so that means I lost 480 quarter pounders from McDonald's. That's some McDonald's math for you guys. I actually brought a picture to show for comparison, I'd like to share with you guys. I've spent the past year and a half totally locked in. In fact, recently I was trying to set a new record on my Peloton bike. If you don't know what the Peloton is, it's like this super powered stationary bike. And I know. How do you know someone has a Peloton? They'll tell you they have a Peloton. But anyways, I'm down in my basement spinning away while my two kids, Landon and Aubrey, are playing. And my spidey sense starts to tingle at a certain point because Landon, my rowdy 3-year-old, is being a bit too quiet behind the couch. Yeah. I say, Landon, what are you doing, buddy? And his head pops up, completely covered in blue marker. Just completely covered. And confidently looks at me and says, nothing. What a little liar. So I see him covered in marker, but I also only have 5 minutes left on the bike. I'm trying to get this record. So I had a choice to make. Finish the class, get that record, baby. Or be a responsible caretaker of human life and clean his face. Cooler heads prevailed. I pop off the bike to clean him up. No, I'm totally kidding. I let him sit there for 5 minutes, full-blown Smurf, while I finished. Don't worry. I've already submitted that story to the Academy for my Dad of the Year award. All that to say, I've been locked in on this goal. Now, even though I'm in way better physical shape than I once was, I remember waking up at my heaviest and asking the question, how did I get here? Have you ever asked that question? Maybe about something emotional, an issue in a relationship, physical health, maybe even dryness in your spiritual life. How did I get here? Well, the same way I improved is how I found myself in a lousy spot physically. It was one step over time. Those steps in the wrong direction or the right direction determine your destination. Isn't that the truth? Your direction determines your destination. So for all of us, what's our desired destination? As Christians, our pinnacle human is Jesus. Our lives should constantly be looking more like his perfect love, mission, and inclusivity of everyone. If you're the least bit curious about how to make yourself look more like Jesus every day, lean in with me today as we go to our Bibles. Let's start at the beginning to see the first people who followed him. I'm talking about the disciples. The story that we'll read today is found in the book of Mark, which is written by, anyone guess it? Sunday school? Yes? Anyone? Mark. You really went out on a limb there. So, Mark is out to set the record straight on who Jesus is and to show people why he was, in fact, the Messiah. The first part of Mark is set in Galilee. Jesus' time in Galilee is marked by people being amazed at who he was and what he was doing. In verse 11 of the first chapter, we see that God descends upon Jesus and tells him, "You are my beloved son." Needless to say, this guy's making waves. People are starting to hear about this Jesus guy. So that brings us to our passage, Mark chapter 1, starting at verse 16. In this account, we see Jesus calling his first disciples. One day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, Those three powerful words. Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people. And they left their nets at once and followed him. A little farther up the shore, Jesus saw Zebedee's sons, James and John, in a boat repairing their nets. He called them at once, and they also followed him, leaving their father Zebedee right there in the boat with the hired men. Now, whether you're new to this church thing or not, you're probably like me the first time I read this. My instant reaction is, I have questions, okay? First, they just up and leave? Like, seriously, though, how could you not read this and be like, isn't that the exact kind of stranger danger that I warn my kids about all the time? Like, to you and I, this seems so bizarre. It does remind me, though, of all the times that I'm pondering the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I know, really mature. There's a reason that I'm the kids guy around here, okay? But as I watch sprawling stories with superpowered beings, wizards, and aliens, there are definitely times that I'm confused and I start to question things. The thing that I constantly have to remind myself, though, is that these movies are made for children, not 31-year-old man children. And the refrain is always, you can't pull too far on that thread, because ultimately asking too many questions unravels the fabric of the entire thing. But the questions that you may have about why these guys would drop everything to follow Jesus is not one of those unraveling threads. No, actually asking questions about it gives context that goes a long way to understanding why they would drop everything. Besides the small fact that Jesus is the Messiah, okay? So let me tell you a little bit about these guys and their culture for a minute. You've got four guys in this passage. You've got Simon, Andrew, James, and John. Simon, most commonly known as Peter, is probably the most famous disciple, and he was also the first. He was a fisherman from the city of Capernaum. Andrew was Simon Peter's brother, and he was a follower of John the Baptist. James was a fisherman too. He was good friends with Peter and part of the inner circles of the disciples. John was James's brother and a loyal follower of Jesus. He was with Jesus from the very beginning. Actually, at this point, it's worth noting that this wasn't the first time that Jesus had met this group of men. So he wasn't a random stranger coming to them. John the Baptist had actually told them about Jesus before meeting him. Again, Jesus' name is starting to get around. But let's talk about the background of these men from Galilee. The people of Galilee lived and died by the Torah. If you're like, what's the Torah? Well, the Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible. The Torah was the focus of their educational system. Most kids at this time would start to learn about it when they were as young as 6 years old. And by the age of 10, most kids would have the Torah memorized by heart. Past this point is where you start to see a fork in the road for most boys. The best of them would continue learning about the scriptures and eventually seek to apprentice a rabbi. Now, it was a grueling process to apprentice a rabbi. There were lots of steps. It took a lot of time. They would grill them with all kinds of questioning. But after all that time, if the rabbi really thought that the kid in front of them could be a rabbi one day, they would say those 3 powerful words, come, follow me. At the age of 14, 15 years old, they would leave their family and friends to go follow this rabbi. Simply put, they devoted their lives to them. They wanted to know everything that they could to teach others just like them. So what about the rest of the boys who didn't pursue this path? Well, they would start to learn how to make money or develop their craft in a trade. So fast forward back to our passage. Rabbis, we know that they're one of the most honored and respected people anywhere. And Jesus, the new rabbi, he comes across these normal fishermen along the Sea of Galilee. He calls them to follow him. The guys who weren't following another rabbi. So that means they're not the best of the best. That means they didn't make the cut. I remember when I was a kid, my siblings and I, we went on a road trip with my grandparents. This wasn't a typical road trip. My grandparents, they live in the countryside of Oregon. They live in Astoria, Oregon. Has anyone ever heard of Astoria, Oregon? Like 2 people. Okay, that's really sad. Far be it from me to call you a liar. I don't know many people that actually know Astoria. No, I'm kidding. But It's a tiny town in Oregon, okay? And my grandparents, they had recently bought an old Greyhound bus. It was like from the 40s, didn't have air conditioning, none of that. And they renovated it to be a personal RV. It was like the original DIY project before YouTube, okay? So we set out on a road trip from Astoria, Oregon to Dallas, Texas. Now, I've shared that story this morning a couple times, and I hear a couple like, oof, oh. It's a long drive with no air conditioning, okay? But I love my grandpa. He's awesome, and one of the things I've always admired is that he's real handy and prepared. And one night, everyone's asleep, and I'm sitting at the front of the bus with him, and he gives me this big map. And he says, here, I think you're ready for this. He asked me to be the navigator. Now, I know to some younger folks in here that the thought of using a paper map sounds like something out of a National Treasure movie where we took it and had to blow all the dust off of it, like, you know. But genuinely, it felt incredible in that moment to be trusted with that. Why? Because he had faith in me. Simple as that. Now, perhaps he was just distracting me because I had raging ADHD and annoyed the snot out of him on this trip. But I'm going to take Gramps at face value on this one because it makes for a far better illustration. But in all seriousness, I still remember that moment vividly. My grandpa was always looking at that map and plotting our course. It was a big deal, and at that moment, he looked at me and was basically saying, I think you can do what I do. So, in regards to these fishermen, these normal guys, of course they dropped everything to follow Jesus. Jesus is looking at them in the same way and saying, I think you can do what I do. He chooses them because his movement is for everyone. He chooses these normal guys. What's the encouragement to you and I? Well, it's if we've ever felt like we're not good enough, we don't measure up. Jesus didn't go to the best of the best. Who were the first people on his list? These normal, ordinary fishermen. The Son of God had faith in them, and he has faith in us to carry out his mission. I'm reminded of Paul's words to the church of Corinth about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting at verse 25. Paul has some powerful things to share. He says, this foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise, and he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. I love the way this passage starts, this foolish plan of God. The most extraordinary story ever told is one that we would not think to write ourselves. We would not nominate ourselves to be part of that story, but we're part of God's plan. There's a couple things that Paul's making clear here. The first is that Paul's being real and sharing that the world will sometimes see deep devotion to Jesus as strange. So we shouldn't tell ourselves that it's somehow different for us in our generation. Following Jesus has always been awkward and at odds with culture. And while some people make it stranger than it needs to be, we have to get comfortable realizing that unspiritual people don't normally understand spiritual things. And this would have been true for the apostles that Jesus called to follow him. But another point that Paul makes in this, he hammers home this critical point, is that you are invaluable to God. No matter what the world thinks of you, no matter what your background is, your story, no matter if you don't have the education, you are invaluable to God. So the first disciples, they didn't have a random encounter with Jesus. It was part of God's plan and a tremendous honor to be called. This was the call from the majors. They weren't randomly dropping everything. They were actively dropping everything to follow Jesus. When they followed him, it's because they were focused on who they wished to become. And who do they want to become like? It was this new rabbi, this Jesus guy. He is awesome. I want to be just like him. Many of us ask the question, what does God want me to do with my life? Well, the answer is right here. Our goal is to be like Jesus. Not every once in a while or when you're around certain people. It's moment by moment. If that's the goal, then let's look at 3 things Jesus did that we can emulate, among many things. The first, Jesus spent time with God. Jesus served others. And Jesus shared about God. Let's talk about that first one, spent time with God. It's very early in Jesus' ministry, and he's just had an extraordinary day, a day full of teaching and healing, and people are all curious about this new rabbi, and the crowds find out that Jesus is staying at Peter's mother-in-law's house. So they flood in that direction. Let's read about it in Mark chapter 1, verse 35. Before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. Jesus knew that time with his Father was important. So the next morning, while it's still dark, everyone's asleep, what does Jesus do? He sneaks away from the group to have some alone time with God. Boy, is it easy to allow our days to become so busy that we feel like we don't have enough time to spend alone with God. You ever have that where you ask God to hold on and wait, promising, I'll get to you, big guy. Just want to have a little bit of free time. It's so easy for our time spent with God to just slip from our list of priorities. Now, this is a mistake of epic proportions that I myself have made many times. We will never know God if we don't spend time with him. If you were to breeze through the Gospels, it doesn't take long for you to understand and notice that Jesus took every opportunity he could to be with God. And yet we tend to think that we don't have enough time for God because of how busy we are. But Jesus, he knew that the more busy he became, the more he needed and depended on time with God. After feeding the 5,000, before choosing the 12 disciples, even after he's become so wildly popular that everyone's demanding his time, he went to spend time with God. Our time alone with God is vital for our relationship to grow. I love what we see about this in James chapter 4, verse 8. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. If Jesus, who is the Son of God, needed to spend time alone with the Father to remain obedient and keep a growing relationship with him, then how much more do we need that time with him? If we aren't spending time with God, then that's a pretty major hurdle to walking in step with the Spirit. We need to listen to his word in our lives. God's will isn't for us to check off all the prerequisite boxes on a list, but instead is to experience a full relationship with him daily. This is the source that everything else comes from. It begs the question, what could we cut out from our schedule and our routine so that God could have more of our time and attention? Another thing that Jesus did really well was he served others. It's a short, profound statement. The Son of God came to serve, not be served. Let's look at John chapter 13, verse 1. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It's just hours before Jesus would be beaten, crucified, and buried. What does he decide to do? He wants to have one last meal with his disciples. Knowing that this is their last few minutes together, Jesus wants them to be sure of exactly how he feels about them. So he gives them one last crystal clear picture of how much he does. How does he do it? He washes their feet. Jesus spent about 3.5 years with these guys, years of encouraging, providing for, leading, teaching, and molding them into who they were created to be. But it wasn't until he took on the role of servant, washing their feet, that he showed them how much he truly loved them. We can learn from Jesus' example that it's through serving others that we really express our love for them. For most of us, through our words, we really try to express our love for someone we care about. But let's be reminded of what John says in 1 John chapter 3, verse 18. Dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let us show that truth by our actions. Man, that'll preach. It is through our actions and service to others that we really show a loving, heart. Jesus' entire life was an offering of service towards others that culminated in his death on the cross. Try to picture Jesus washing these guys' feet at their last meal together. The only way he could wash another person's feet is to literally kneel before them as they lifted their foot up to him. The Son of God in this position of humility. A physical action that speaks loudly, I consider you more important than me. If we can ever truly convince ourselves of this, it's that others are more important than we are. Then we can truly begin to love like Jesus loved. A third thing that Jesus did was he shared about God. Let's talk about what he said to these guys. I will make you fishers of men. He wanted them to learn what it took to share the good news. Now, I'm not a big fishing guy. In fact, I've only ever gone fishing a handful of times. But I do have some practice because my kids have these lovely fishing toys. Okay? So when my kids were young, they had this fishing toy, okay? Real nice, old school, American made. I don't know, probably not. But at the end of this fishing rod, you got a magnet, and then you got this clear, pinpointed spot of exactly where to get the fish. I'm kind of a master at this game, okay, guys? I'm like really good at it. This is like shooting fish in a barrel, okay? So even my young kids, as they grew older, they're like, okay, this is too easy. So they graduated to a much more annoying toy, and it's this one. So this is like this plastic contraption. It spins around. Where are the other plastic fish? That could be a National Treasure movie. I have no idea. We need Nicolas Cage to find where these kids put all these plastic fish. I have no idea. Money down the drain. Anyways. But these guys, they spin around, and their mouths constantly open and close. They're chomping, and you take this little plastic rod with these tiny little hooks, and you keep just going and going. Honestly, it's just super annoying. This one separates the men from the boys, okay? It'll put some hair on your chest. At least that's what I tell myself. I don't know. But you have to keep trying over and over again to get this fish to latch on. It reminds me of what it looks like to disciple people. We may think it's like the first toy. One-stop shop, I know what to do, it's going to be quick and easy, I put it right there. But actually, it takes a lot of time. It's something that we have to continuously work on. Making disciples isn't easy, but it's necessary. And I'll tell you this, just like this toy, it may take quite a few attempts to hook that fish, to share the good news with that person, and for them to receive it in the same way. I mean, look at Jesus. Even Jesus drew a mixed reaction from his time in Galilee. Now, I know it's super shocking to imagine that people could have very polarizing opinions. You're like, unknowable universe, I can't even fathom that. I don't know. But along the lines of facing adversity, I recently heard a great quote from Chris Bosh. You might remember him. He was the third guy that made up the big three for the Miami Heat in 2010. The Heat were the villains of the NBA because they formed a super team. They ended up winning 2 championships in 4 years, and they're considered one of the greatest teams of all time. But Chris Bosh had this to say about the jeering that their team received. Throughout the process, you just learn that criticism is a tax on success. So I must be doing something right. Let me say that again. Throughout the process, you just learn that criticism is a tax on success. So I must be doing something right. One of the things that I really relate to in that quote is that making disciples is not always going to be easy, and we will face our fair share of criticism for doing it. It usually means that you're running into the mess rather than away from it. The Bible tells us of the trials and persecutions that the disciples face, at times even facing death. So, can we expect some pushback as we share the good news? Certainly. But don't worry. Some of the pushback and criticism that you face probably just means that you're doing something right. In the face of adversity, the disciples didn't hide, they didn't give up, they put their trust in God and kept moving the gospel around the world. Nothing stood in their way. But how do you do this whole disciple thing? Well, Jesus did it first through a relationship with his 12 followers. He genuinely cared for them. One thing I find really interesting, though, is that Jesus didn't expect massive instantaneous action from the disciples. I've had countless people come up to me and say, "What's your secret to weight loss?" And honestly, the answer isn't all that satisfying. There's a lot of reasons that I think I found success this time around. But it all boiled down to one straightforward idea. How can I get 1% better every day with my health and fitness? 1% better every day. So what did that look like? Well, it meant that when I was out for a run, if you could call it that, that I was trying to get a better time by a few seconds each time. I wanted to improve in a sustainable way. Now, this wasn't my own idea, but instead something that I read from a fantastic book called Atomic Habits, which I highly recommend to anyone who's interested. But this book spoke to me because it talked about how we think that massive success requires massive instantaneous action. But if you make small daily improvements, the math tells you that if you get 1% better each day for 1 year, you're going to end up way better by the time that you're done, as opposed to trying to do everything all at once. There's a lot more that I would love to share about that process and journey, but the best way I could distill what this book illuminated for me is that if you want to set a goal, then don't focus on what you want to achieve, but focus on who you wish to become. Don't focus on what you want to achieve, but focus on who you wish to become. How many goals have we contemplated about, strived for, but gave up on because we burned out? We psyched ourselves out because we were trying to do way too much at the beginning. We got intimidated by the what that we were trying to achieve. That even gets in our way as Jesus followers. Every Jesus follower has a goal, and today I want it to help us gain an extra clear glimpse at what that looks like for us to chase down. Our goal is to be like Jesus. And I know it sounds so churchy, but it's exactly what we're called to. Looking at the disciples, they got 1% better over time. They took one more step each day towards this life that God intended for them until they were ready to take the lead. Jesus took his time preparing them for the mission field. The phrase, "I will make you become," implying a gradual training. This reminds me of something on my Peloton. I know, I can't stop talking about this thing. But on there, they have this thing called a Strive score. It's this personal metric that measures the intensity of your workout using your heart rate and other things. Basically, it shows you how hard you were working in that workout. And here's what's great about that. There are days that I don't hit a new record on the bike or land some new achievement. I could be bummed, but instead, I can see through my Strive score that I still put in my best effort. Did I achieve exactly what I wanted to? No. But did I work hard and get 1% closer to becoming the person I want to become? Yes. Stop for a moment and think about what your Strive score to be like Jesus would look like each day. The intensity of that pursuit. What's beautiful is to understand that God doesn't have some quota sheet looking for you to fill, but instead wants to know how much of your heart is in it each day. If you didn't bring a new believer to the kingdom that day, could you look and actually see that you got 1% closer to hooking that person? I mean, the reason Jesus' message to his disciples was about multiplying themselves is that it's essential. Jesus' instructions weren't for the disciples just to tell people about him, but instead to teach them to be like him. This is because God did not want the world to simply know about Jesus, but on a much grander and more valuable scale, he wanted them to be like him. This won't happen by any means other than personal discipleship. Our goal as Jesus followers is not tracked on a spreadsheet with momentary achievements. It's tracked by a lifelong mission to become as Christ-like as possible. Will there be setbacks? You betcha. Do they disqualify you from being a part of the movement? Absolutely not. Because we have a God that values relationships over rules. We have a God that offers grace instead of judgment. And we have a God who sent us Jesus. Case closed, game over. That's all you need to know, folks. Our God loves us that much. Some of you, maybe you're intimidated to take that next step with Jesus for fear of failure. But I'm telling you that there's grace with God. If you really want to be like Jesus, then get 1% better in these ways each day. These 3 ways we're talking about. Each day, find ways to carve out more time to pray and be in your Bible. Set a reminder on your phone. Sacrifice TV time. Sign up for a reading plan on the Bible app. Each day, look for the opportunities that are all around to serve others. Encouraging a coworker going through a difficult time. Doing yard work for a neighbor. Simply anticipating a need of someone else and meeting that need. Each day, try to figure out a way that you can grow his kingdom by sharing the good news. You think of the purpose of a witness in the courtroom, it's to speak. We may shy away sometimes from speaking about God with others and say, I choose to witness through my actions, but part of our walk is also speaking. We can't exclusively rely on this action-based interpretive dance for everyone else to decipher. Remember, 1 step over time. Your direction determines your destination. I'm guessing some of us in here have never taken a real meaningful step towards Jesus. And I want to tell you, you're in the right place, my friend. You belong right here even before you believe. Some of us, maybe we're at the point where we've taken 1 step forward and 2 steps back with Jesus. And man, I've been there myself. But today's a new day. All of us have the chance to start or continue a streak today and take a step. Don't focus on what you want to achieve, but focus on who you wish to become. Let's start becoming like Jesus.